How is everyone? I recognise that this is the sixth of a lot of interesting discussions today, so I'll try to keep it in plain English. I should also apologise because I am an economist and I'm the sixth speaker, but I'll try to keep it painless. So as Melissa said, my background, a little bit of background to me, I'm an environmental resource economist based in Melbourne, originally from Adelaide. An environmental economist, basically we spend our time thinking about how the environment impacts on the economy and how the economy impacts on the environment. And in the area of water, for the past decade, as Melissa said, I've been really fortunate to work with Commonwealth governments and organisations like Melbourne Water to address the issue of how do we figure out what our objectives are, how do we show that the community is willing to pay to have those investments implemented, and then how do we align funding so that we can actually deliver those assets so that they work in the first instance and then are properly maintained throughout their life cycle. And so, as Melissa said, we've done things like developer contributions, offsets, rainwater tank auctions in Melbourne Water, where through Living River funding we ran an auction for households where we wanted to disconnect a creek, and we essentially had a bidding auction where people ran and bid for rainwater tanks to be installed onto their house to disconnect the catchment. And then we've also run processes like end-to-end processes like what Andy was talking about this morning. So last year we ran with the ACT government, we basically reviewed from end to end all of their stormwater assets, looked at the condition of those assets, the extent to which they were on registers. We then figured out what the bow wave for them was in terms of what it was going to cost to achieve their stormwater objectives and what that funding requirement was going to be. And then we looked at how essentially what sort of funding mechanisms they could use, and also importantly what sort of institutions, rearrangements they needed to be able to have that process to run. And so they're now in the process of implementing that after it was accepted by Cabinet. Sorry, the other thing that I should say before I talk more is that I'm a rather nervous talker, and I have a bit of a habit of starting to speed up when I talk. So if I start to talk too quickly, just somebody throw something at me. And that'll help me along. Okay, the other thing that I wanted to say just at the outset is that I think this discussion today has been really useful, and I think this last talk really builds on a series of threads that are coming through, and it's sort of in some ways a nice case study. So, you know, this morning, and Mayor Evans talked about the political and broader context of funding requirements. Stephen then talked about the different types of models that could be used, and then Andy talked about how we needed to say what is the problem that we're trying to address, and then work through from that problem definition to understand that the community supports it, and then say, okay, we live in a second best world. What's the best funding mechanism that we can put in place given the real politic of the environment that we work in? And as an economist, you know that. Economists always deal in our heads in a first best world. So we sort of think, what's the best economic instrument that we could use here? But in reality, as Andy said, you know, Mike Young, who's an economist out of Adelaide, always says, you know, we don't live in a perfect world. So let's think about what is actually implementable. And what I'm talking about here today in the Kingston scheme is a second best solution that sort of works along those lines. And the other thing that I would say, yep, I'll get onto that in a second. And the last point that I'd make is that we just talked earlier on around valuation. In Melbourne in particular, there's about a decade worth of economic valuation work around water sensitive urban design, and we've got benefit cost tools and valuation tools already that could help you guys here in Adelaide do a lot of the heavy lifting. You know, we can value the property price premium that you get from having greener infrastructure next to your house, and we can value whether it's a wetland or whether it's a lake or whether it's a rehabilitated drain. We can value the health benefits, but we can also, more importantly, in dollar terms, value the productivity benefits. So that health benefit figure that was put up is your avoided life healthcare cost. But actually the real benefit that you get is the change in presenteeism and absenteeism from work as a result of people being off ill. And we've worked with Deakin Economics, their health economics team, to develop an epidemiological model that essentially allows us to estimate those productivity impacts. So there's a lot of learning that, and there are a lot of people in Melbourne who would be more than willing to help out in those discussions. So maybe we can talk about that later on. All right, so now onto my discussion. So what we're talking about today is an approach that Kingston City Council has developed to address pretty much the identical set of circumstances as were brought up in the Charles Sturt situation. Kingston City Council is an inner city suburb. It's a bayside council, pretty much like Charles Sturt. Its primary form of development over the next 20 to 30 years is infill development, so stuff less than the 0.4 of a hectare. The majority of the development, other than a couple of greenfield areas, is all going to be infill. Kingston City Council is also, under the State Environmental Protection Policy, responsible for protecting the health of waterways and the bay. So they are an agency who is charged to achieve water quality outcomes in the bay. So they have a clear legislative basis for wanting to undertake investments in stormwater that contribute to better waterway health and better bay health. Okay? Kingston also sat back about 5 years ago and said, we've got infill development, we're meant to be looking after the bay, and we have a strong culture, in particular within the councillors and within engineering and infrastructure department, around recognising the value of green infrastructure. But at the moment, we don't have a plan, we don't have a set of objectives to deliver that plan, and we don't have a clear indication that the community would support us if we went out and said, we want to build a whole bunch of green infrastructure stormwater assets. And most importantly, at the back end, even if we did have that, we don't have a line of sight to, once we've built these things, how do we actually maintain them? So about 5 years ago, Kingston, with Living Rivers funding from Melbourne Water, started what's effectively a 5-year process that's captured in a snapshot there of first developing an integrated water cycle strategy that said, what are we doing it? What are our regulatory obligations? What are our community obligations, i.e. what has the community told us they want in terms of livability and green infrastructure? After they did that, they said, okay, now that we understand what we want to deliver in terms of stormwater quality outcomes, how do we get there? Is it achievable that we can get there doing works on public lands? Or do we do it on private at the lot scale? After that, they said, and I'll show a couple of slides on this, but after that, they realised that for a number of reasons, including some of the problems that we discussed this morning, it's going to be far more cost effective and probably deliver better environmental and bay outcomes if the majority of these investments occur off-site, so they don't occur on private landholders' lots. And the reason for that is what we've found in Melbourne is probably 70% of on-site lot assets are failing. They're not delivering their stormwater function because after you get your certificate saying you've got your building compliance, they disconnect them, or they do tricky things like they get around the Subdivision Act so that they don't have to install the assets. So we have an asset problem essentially where we have non-functioning assets, and that means we double invest because we have no confidence that the on-site assets are delivering the off-site solutions, so we have to back them up. So Kingston made the decision that maybe what we want to do is we want to have an off-site mechanism so that we can operate and maintain those assets and we can get some economies of scale. And then they said, okay, so how do we fund this? And we went, and that's pretty much in 2014 is when we came into the picture, and we were given a brief that I'll show you in a second that essentially said we want to have what Andy said earlier on. We want to have an equitable scheme, we want to have an efficient scheme, we want to have a flexible scheme, we want to have revenue stability, and we want to have transparency so that people who are participating in the scheme have confidence in it. Can you help us out? All make sense? This is pretty much Birgit earlier on said, what's the background context? This is the background context for Kingston, which I've really just discussed. Integrated water strategy, guidance for developers and other sorts of tools developed on what their stormwater obligations are, and then our report in the top right-hand corner around implementing stormwater treatment projects. I'll step through all of this, but essentially, again, a top-to-bottom approach of saying what are our objectives, what's the most efficient way to get there, and having a good sort of narrative, developing a good narrative all the way through it. That's a couple of pictures of Kingston. It's a nice bayside area. Lots of young families moving in, subdividing properties and other sorts of stuff. In addition to Kingston's water quality objectives under the SEP, the State Environmental Policy, they also have an objective of a 100% stormwater quality, achieving 100% stormwater quality by 2040, and a 15% decrease in potable water use by 2040. So those sort of additional goals that came through in the IWM strategy, and that, again, that was based on community consultation and asking people, are you willing to pay for this sort of stuff through rates? This is a kind of important slide in the context of understanding Kingston, and I think in some ways it's very similar to Charles Sturt. So, as Birgit was saying earlier on, in Victoria we have policy and legislation that says properties that subdivide have to meet state environmental protection policies, stormwater quality requirements. It's called Clause 56. It only applies to certain types of developments. It doesn't apply to commercial, and it doesn't apply to industrial, and it doesn't apply to a property that doesn't subdivide, and it doesn't apply to things like apartments. Okay? In Kingston, the bar down the bottom basically shows what the future impervious area is going to look like, and essentially the future impervious area is going to be mainly infill residential, a little bit of industrial, and retail and commercial and other. And then on top of that, we've also got roads. So the key point of this slide is that a Clause 56 focused just on subdivision isn't going to cut it. All of the other development's just going to run over the top of it. And you're going to have increasing impervious area, increasing runoff, and what we achieve under Clause 56 is going to be dwarfed. Okay? I think pretty much you've got a similar story here in some ways, in terms of the types of development profiles you're looking at. Kingston then went on and said, okay, let's do some evidence-based research around what's going to be most cost-effective. How do we deliver biggest bang for buck? Biggest bang for buck, Kingston measured as the reduction in the improvement in stormwater quality, measured by nitrogen, the amount of non-potable reuse they got, so essentially public open space irrigation, and a couple of other variables that they said were important to them. And then they looked at a couple of different types of projects. So they looked at small sorts of investments. So they're sort of the things on the left-hand side, your rainwater tank and your rain garden, with a very small, a very small sort of catchment area. They then looked at medium and large investments as well. Large investments are the ones in the middle, for example, precinct scale wetlands. And then a medium-sized type of treatment is the irrigation to an oval, for example. So that's capturing, let's say, 50 hectares. It's got a stormwater catchment area of 50 hectares. We didn't do this work. A bunch of smart engineers who we work with did this work. But essentially what it came back showing is that the small-scale stuff is not really cost-effective on a dollar-for-dollar basis, and also there's a higher risk of failure. The large scale, they have the same problem as most infill areas. They don't have the land to be able to put the assets in. And those middle-sized infrastructure pieces are the ones that prove to be most cost-effective. They also site on Kingston's land, and that means Kingston can own, operate and maintain those assets. So Kingston basically then said, okay, at the moment we've got 40% treatment. With a series of proposed investments, they identified 31 odd precinct scale assets. And we can get to, with those assets, we can get to up to about 76% treatment efficiency with these assets. So essentially that goes back to Andy's point of, know what you're going to build before you start gathering cash. So Kingston has a prioritised list of investments. And they've modelled using music essentially what that's going to do to waterways and water quality and loads entering into the bay. Now we get to our next stage. So for those 31 precinct scale assets, it's about, the capital cost alone is about 27.5 million, okay, to achieve those outcomes. So the next question is, okay, how do we fund that? And as we were talking about this morning, you know, there are a range of different options that we can think about. The brief, and this is really where we came into the project in 2014, is Kingston said to us, how do we fund precinct scale investments, these 31 odd assets, how do we fund them in a way that is cost reflective and impactor pays? So basically, if you are creating impervious area, as Andy said earlier on, you should be paying for that, the stormwater runoff for the impervious area that you create, because you're creating the impact. And by the way, OCOSA would support that principle. They basically say impactor pays, then beneficiary pays, then taxpayer pays. That's their sort of rule for benefit for cost sharing. So impactor pays approach. The second point is really important. We want to give the developments flexibility to meet best practice stormwater management. So we don't want to lock them into an either or situation. We want to give them choice. And that choice is really important in Melbourne in particular, and I'll explain why in a second. We want it to be equitable. So if you've got a square metre of impervious area and you're residential or a commercial, you're treated exactly the same way, not different rules for different people. We want it to fully fund the life cycle cost of the investments. So one of the things that Brigitte was speaking about earlier on is that developer charges and the Melbourne Water Offset only funds the upfront capital cost. Kingston came to this point after we talked to them. They realised that if they just fund the capital costs, then essentially what happens is the ratepayers cross-subsidise somebody else for maintaining and rehabilitating that asset. And when you've got a growing asset base, you've got a growing deferral, you've got a growing sort of bow wave that you're going to have to address in capital rehabilitation. So they said, can we fund the full life cycle costs through it? This hasn't been done before in Australia. We don't, and this was the kicker for us. Okay, we want all of that, but we don't want you to put upward pressure on rates. We have a rate-capped environment in Victoria. We don't want new fees. We don't want new charges on existing property owners. Can you find us $27.5 million, please? So, and this is sort of the future that it sounds like South Australia is going to be moving into as well. We're in a rate-capped environment. How do we find additional funds? And then finally, we want to provide a mechanism for everybody that's easy to calculate, simple to implement, and streamlines the planning permit application. So rather than making things more difficult, can we make it less difficult? That essentially, they were the guidelines that we were given when we started out on this. So I'll tell you what's being implemented, and then I'll tell you a little bit more about what it is. The end point that we've got to now, and I would say this has been implemented. It's up and running as of January, and I'll show you some stats on how many applications and how much they've collected. But what is being implemented now is that when a developer, so first point is that this only applies to new developments where you have to have a permit through council, but that covers a whole range of commercial, industrial, residential, and other types of developments. So it's got very broad application in Kingston. The developer has to provide a stormwater management plan that addresses flooding and addresses pollution. They then have two choices around how they address, in particular, the pollution, so stormwater quality, on site. So they can either do it through on-site treatment, i.e. put in rain gardens or rainwater tanks or whatever else, or they can use the Melbourne Water Offset if they're in one of the areas that Brigitte talked about in Kingston where that applies, or they can opt in to the Kingston voluntary contribution mechanism. And under that mechanism, it's exactly what Andy described. Essentially, they pay a per square metre impervious charge, and I'll tell you how we calculated that in a second, but it's slightly different from offsets. So they pay that money. Importantly, that money goes into a reserve fund, which under the Local Government Act is ring-fenced. So this is ring-fenced money. It's also audited money, and Kingston is under the obligation to publicly, to have it audited and also to then publicly notify people of that the funds are being used properly, and also the types of outcomes that are being delivered with those funding. So there's a clear line of sight and transparency, but importantly, it's ring-fenced. And then that money is used to invest in priority council projects, both for the assets to be built, the assets to be maintained, and the assets to be rehabilitated. Okay, a bit of a busy slide, I apologise. So what's different about this in lieu fee? Okay, so first of all, again, as I said, this only applies to areas where you have to get a permit and you come into the scheme. It's not retrospective, doesn't apply if you don't do anything to your lot. But it's if you know what your development front looks like and you've got a reasonable amount of confidence in what your development front looks like, this gives you stable revenue or stable cash. The first point is the in lieu fee is cost reflective, so the impactor basically pays based on impervious area. The second point is, okay, it's flexible. So we were asked to make a flexible mechanism. It's flexible because it allows the developer to choose to develop on-site, do the compliance on-site, or to pay the fee. This is really important in Victoria because we have this thing called VCAT. If you have a fee or a charge, at VCAT, which is the Victorian Civil Administrative Tribunal, can basically be challenged by developers, and they will challenge it. So you're going to get bogged down in VCAT with a fee. If you make the mechanism voluntary, they can't, because they're opting into the mechanism. So this is really important, and it's a second best world, but this is a neat solution. It gets you around a whole bunch of process that you have to, in terms of either establishing the fee and justifying the fee, or saying, actually, no, this is a voluntary mechanism. Okay? So as a voluntary mechanism, it gets us around a lot of administrative problems that we might get into trouble with developers. I don't know if that applies if you've got the equivalent in South Australia. It fully funds the life cycle costs. So again, the way that we've priced this mechanism isn't just for the capital, but it's for the capital, the operating maintenance, and the rehabilitation of those assets, plus an administrative fee. So it includes all the costs of that asset. There's no cross-subsidisation occurring in this scheme, and that's very different from a Melbourne Water offset or a developer charge. This is the important point though. This fee is priced between the flags, and what I mean by that is most offsets and other charges are basically based on the efficient cost of supplying that infrastructure, okay? You have to do that if you're a regulated entity. Local government councils aren't regulated entities. So what we did is we looked at what it would cost for developers to do the equivalent abatement on site and what it's going to cost council to do the abatement. And essentially, in most cases, it's about double for the developer to do the treatment on site compared to what it costs council. So that creates two flags. There's a lower bound flag of what it's going to cost council, and there's an upper bound flag of what it's going to cost the developer. And we priced it in the middle, approximately in the middle. And the reason that we do that, there are a couple of advantages. First, it means Kingston covers their backsides. They're not going to get into a situation like Melbourne Water did where they don't have enough, where they're collecting cash but they don't build the asset until 5 years, and then you've had cost creep and all of a sudden they're out of pocket and they've got to recover it somehow. So you're creating a risk buffer. The other reason that we've priced it with a premium is because things go wrong. We all know with stormwater assets that these things don't always operate the way they should, and so even your best engineering designs, you're going to have cost blowouts sometimes. This builds in a risk buffer that for things go wrong sort of story. The other reason we do it is because when you collect more from the developer, it actually allows you to start to preempt where the development's going to happen, and you can build these assets before the development occurs, which is actually what you're supposed to do with an offset. An offset is meant to offset the impact of development at the time the development occurs. If a wetland takes 3 years, 5 years, 3 years, 5 years to come up to speed, you need to have that wetland in the ground 3 to 5 years before that development occurs. Having funding up front allows you to do that. So you're ahead of the game. The other thing is everybody wins under this mechanism. The developer wins because they pay less to achieve their stormwater compliance. They also win because they get a faster approval process, so they're not caught up having to go through certification, and time is money for developers in Kingston. Kingston wins because they get to develop the assets that they want, they get to maintain and operate them with a ring-fenced fund, and they've got a risk buffer. That's the scheme that we've set up in Kingston. It's a transparent mechanism. We work with developers in Melbourne. We went out and tested this. We sat down over beers with a couple of developers and said, we're thinking about doing this. What do you reckon? And developers said, no, this will work. So we checked it with developers before anything went into the ground in addition to community. It's easy to calculate. I can provide you with a link. Kingston has resources online, which has the calculator so developers can see exactly what it's going to cost. And the money goes into a reserve fund. In lieu calculation, here's a worked example. The main point here is, as I said, the charge is an impervious area charge, so per square metre. You can get credits if you're doing retention on site and other things. You can get a credit back. That's all figured out at the permit scheme. For these guys, and this is a real development, they calculated that it was going to cost about $34,000 to do what they needed to do to meet their obligations on site. The in lieu fee was $29,000 or just under 30 grand before any credit back. They've gone ahead with this. And the reason they went ahead with this is they said, it's kind of line ball, but it gives a certification, it goes away, it speeds things up. So this for them was a no-brainer, and it's one of the reasons why I'm showing it. So progress to date, this is the last slide. As I said, we commenced in January 2017. We commenced with a very quiet start because we wanted to bed it down and make sure that everybody was comfortable. So really the scheme has only been sort of announced in public with developers since about mid-year. We're working, Kingston is a leading council. If you want to talk to councils about how to do infill issues, Kingston, I reckon, is probably best of breed in Melbourne. Great bunch of people to work with and fall over backwards to help out other councils. So if you want to have a chat to people, Birgit or I can put you in contact with them about how to do it. But they worked very closely with Melbourne Waters. They received second round funding for Living Rivers for the implementation of this. Through that framework, we've established a framework that allows them to monitor, evaluate and communicate the impacts and outcomes of the scheme. To date, so remember this scheme is maybe 5 months old in reality. They've had 25 applications for contributions. They've received 300 grand in lieu payments from 14 transactions. There's another 10 or 11 still in the pipeline. That's another $500,000 from talking to Emily the other day. The largest payment was $55,000 for an industrial warehouse, 5,700 square metres. That's now sitting in the reserve fund. The ramp up, we reckon this is going to earn them about $1 million a year. And the reason that we've set up the mechanism this way is because they've got the same sort of delivery issues. $1 million a year is about what they can handle in terms of infrastructure planning and delivery without falling over the top of themselves and starting to have issues in terms of implementation. So we're sort of matching the cash flows to allow them to deliver works and give them a bit of headroom. The other thing about the mechanism is they can reset the price. So they're not locked into a price, they can do an annual review. And that means that if they find that they're not getting enough opt-in, because they're finding that the price is too high, they can drop it back. If their costs of construction change, they can do that as well. So it's an adjustment mechanism that works over time, and there just needs to be a little bit of signalling for developers. And then through the last 6 months, we've identified areas where, always with this sort of things, once you get into the reality of implementation, Donald Rumsfeld once made that famous quote where everybody sort of guffawed at him when he said, you know the things, what is it? You know some things you know, there are things you don't know, and then there are things you don't know, things you know. No, there are things you know, things you know you don't know, and then there are the things you don't know. Everybody laughed at him, but the more you think about it, it's actually quite there are things we didn't know that we didn't know, and as he said, you learn by getting stuff wrong and then trying to get it less wrong the next time. So what we found in Kingston is that, some of the issues that we've identified, one of them was a misunderstanding around flooding requirements. So buildings still have to achieve flooding requirements, and they weren't clear on how that sort of worked together with water quality. And that's being addressed. And that's one of the reasons why we've done a bit of a slow start, because you want to figure out all of these teething issues with some pretty sympathetic developers before you sort of go whole hog on this sort of scheme. Any other lessons? Other lessons are this takes time. This is 10% technical and 90% common sense. and you need a good bunch of people, and most of all, you need a motivated council, and in particular councillors as well. When you can get councillor support, and if you can find champions for this sort of scheme, and if you can show them the back end where it's working and say, this sort of scheme can work, whatever it looks like, the whole passage becomes a lot easier. That's me.